Rome, the year 161 of our era. Night had fallen upon the eternal city, enveloping the marble columns of its temples in a shroud of violet twilight. On the Palatine Hill, at the very center of power, where the air itself seemed saturated with stories of triumphs and betrayals, a heavy silence reigned. In the palace of Emperor Antoninus Pius, who for his piety and justice was nicknamed the Pious, not only the day but an entire epoch was coming to an end. The era of peace, known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, had reached its zenith, its golden sunset, and now stood on the threshold of the unknown. The old emperor, who had ruled for 23 years with a wisdom and moderation unmatched since the time of the legendary King Pompilius, lay on his deathbed. His breath was intermittent, like the last beats of the fading heart of the empire. At his bedside, in the flickering light of oil lamps, stood two men, two heirs, whose destinies were inextricably linked by the will of their adoptive father and the whimsical design of the gods. One, his nephew, was tall and stately, with features that already hinted at future dissolution and a love of pleasure. This was Lucius Verus. The other, his son-in-law, was a man of a different sort, of medium height, with a piercing, thoughtful gaze from his brown eyes, and a beard like those worn by Greek philosophers. He radiated an aura of calm and inner strength that seemed almost out of place in this abode of supreme power. His name was Marcus Aurelius. No one could have foreseen that the tranquility so carefully preserved by Antoninus was merely the calm before a storm of unprecedented force. From the east, unsettling rumors were already creeping in about unrest in the powerful Parthian Empire. In the north, beyond the Danube River, barbarian tribes, hitherto dormant, were beginning to gather into hordes, like predators scenting the weakness of their prey. And within the empire itself, in its very arteries, an invisible plague was already lurking, soon to descend upon its cities and villages with a fury capable of eclipsing any war. Antoninus Pius, gathering his last strength, turned to the Praetorian prefect, the commander of the palace guard, and spoke his last word, his final password for the sentries. It was not the name of a god, not a call to glory, but a single Latin concept that had become the quintessence of his reign and a testament for the future. He uttered the word equanimitas, which means equanimity, peace of mind. After this, he turned to the wall and quietly passed into the next world as if falling asleep. At the moment the old emperor's breath ceased, the entire weight of the world, all responsibility for the fates of tens of millions of souls, fell upon the shoulders of the man who least of all desired this power, a man who dreamed of the tranquility of a philosophical school, of conversations with sages, of the search for truth in the depths of his own consciousness. But the gods, or fate in which he so firmly believed, decreed otherwise. The era of tranquility was over. The era of Marcus Aurelius was beginning, an era of wars, plague, rebellions, and the greatest of philosophical endeavors. This is the story of the last of the 5 good emperors, the philosopher on the throne whose life became a tragic poem of duty, honor, and man's eternal struggle with his destiny and with himself. A story etched not only on triumphal arches but on the pages of a secret diary written in a campaign tent on the banks of a frozen Danube, to the howl of barbarian horns and the whisper of eternity. Before a philosopher in a purple toga reigned on the Palatine Hill, in the quiet gardens of the Caelian Hill, far from the splendor of the imperial court, a boy was growing up who was destined to become that philosopher. His name was Marcus Aurelius Verus. The blood of ancient Italic aristocrats and the richest Spanish senators flowed in his veins. But from his earliest childhood, his soul yearned not for gold and power, but for the stars, for knowledge, for the stern simplicity of Stoic wisdom. No one then could have imagined that this serious, thoughtful child would one day wear the imperial crown. His path to the pinnacle of power would be winding and paradoxical, paved not by his ambitions but by a series of deaths and the strange will of one of Rome's most enigmatic emperors. Marcus Aurelius was born on April 26, 121 in Rome into one of the noblest and most influential families of his time. His full name at birth was Marcus Annius Verus, and this name in itself was a sign of belonging to the highest echelon of Roman society. The Annian clan, from which he descended on his father's side, had Italic roots but rose to prominence through immense wealth acquired in the Spanish province of Baetica, a center for the production of olive oil, which in those times was called the liquid gold of the ancient world. His great-grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus the Elder, was the first in the family to achieve senatorial rank, and his grandfather, who bore the same name, held the office of consul 3 times, an exceptional honor, and even served as prefect of Rome. The future emperor's father, also Marcus Annius Verus, had a brilliant though short career as a praetor but died when his son was only 3 years old. Marcus's mother, Domitia Lucilla the Younger, also came from a consular family, inheriting a vast fortune that included a large brick factory on the outskirts of Rome. This factory was not just a source of income, but a strategic asset, supplying materials for the grand construction projects being carried out throughout the empire. Thus, from birth, Marcus was surrounded not only by luxury but also by an atmosphere of responsibility, administration, and service to the state. After his father's death, he was adopted by his paternal grandfather, and the boy grew up on his estate on the Caelian Hill, in an atmosphere of patriarchal austerity, reverence for ancestral traditions, and deep religiosity. His childhood was exemplary for a young aristocrat. He received a brilliant home education. From an early age, he showed unusual seriousness and a thirst for knowledge. In his meditations, he would recall his first tutors with gratitude. From his great-grandfather, he learned good morals and to be free from anger. From the memory of his father, modesty and a manly character. From his mother, piety and beneficence, and also abstinence, not only from evil deeds, but even from evil thoughts. However, a true revolution in his consciousness occurred at the age of 11. It was then that he met the painter and philosopher Diognetus. This mentor not only taught him painting, he opened up a completely new world for him, the world of Stoicism. Diognetus instilled in young Marcus a contempt for empty superstitions, for tales of miracles and incantations. He taught him not to believe slanderers, to engage in philosophy, and to write philosophical dialogues. Under the influence of Diognetus, Marcus became so engrossed in Stoic asceticism that it began to worry his mother. He started to sleep on the bare ground, covered only by a coarse cloak, and only with great difficulty did Domitia Lucilla manage to persuade him to return to a bed covered with skins. This episode was not just a youthful fancy. It was the first glimpse of that unbending will and that striving for inner self-control that would become the core of his personality for the rest of his life. He had put on the philosopher's cloak, a kind of sackcloth that symbolically contrasted with the purple toga of a senator, and as it turned out, he carried it in his soul even when he was forced to don the imperial purple. The boy's fate took a sharp turn when Emperor Hadrian himself took notice of him. Hadrian, who reigned from 117 to 138, was a complex and contradictory figure, an aesthete, a traveler, a poet, an architect, and at the same time a ruthless politician. He was married to Vibia Sabina, who was a distant relative of Marcus. Observing the serious and truthful boy, Hadrian took a liking to him and jokingly nicknamed him Verissimus, which in Latin means most true, subtly playing on his family name, Verus, which also translates as true. This imperial favor was not just praise, it was a sign. At the age of 6, Marcus was enrolled in the priestly college of the Salii, the keepers of the sacred shields, which was a great honor. He performed his duties with zeal, memorizing all the ancient hymns and rituals. But the real drama unfolded around the succession. Hadrian had no children of his own, and the question of a successor was acute. In 136, he adopted Lucius Verus, a brilliant but frail aristocrat, and to strengthen his dynastic position, betrothed young Marcus to Aelius's daughter Chaonia. Marcus, who was only 15, obeyed the emperor's will. However, fate intervened again. On January 1st, 138, Lucius Verus died suddenly. Hadrian, himself already seriously ill and on the verge of death, had to make a new decision urgently, and it turned out to be one of the strangest and most far-sighted in Roman history. Just a few weeks after Aelius's death, on February 25th, 138, Hadrian adopted the 51-year-old senator Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus, the future Emperor Antoninus. But he set one unbreakable condition. Antoninus, in turn, had to immediately adopt two young men. The first was the son of the deceased Lucius Verus, the 7-year-old Lucius Verus. The second was Antoninus's 17-year-old nephew, Marcus Annius Verus. Thus, in one day, by the will of a dying emperor, Marcus's life was turned upside down. He became Marcus Aurelius Verus, a member of the imperial family and a potential heir to the throne. His engagement to Chaonia was broken, and he was now to marry the daughter of his new adoptive father, Annia Galeria Faustina the Younger. He was torn from his familiar world of philosophical conversations and quiet gardens and thrown into the very center of political intrigue. The path to the throne was open, but it was not the path he would have chosen for himself. It was a path of duty laid out for him by others, and the young Stoic accepted it with the same seriousness with which he had earlier accepted the philosopher's cloak. It seemed that young Marcus's fate was sealed. He was the heir's heir, a prince whose future was mapped out for decades to come. But what if the throne was not the goal, but merely a long, almost endless prelude? What if the wait for power became the most important lesson of his life? For 23 years, Marcus Aurelius lived in the shadow of his adoptive father, Emperor Antoninus Pius. It was a period of long, scrupulous apprenticeship, a time when his character was tempered and his mind was honed. But it was also a time of internal struggle, a rift between the alluring power of philosophy and the inexorable demands of public service, between the silence of the library and the noise of the Roman Forum. These 2 decades of peace and tranquility would turn the youth into a man, but they would also be the last peaceful page in the history of his life and that of the entire empire. The reign of Antoninus Pius, which lasted from 138 to 161, went down in history as the golden age of the Roman Empire, the apogee of the so-called Pax Romana. It was an era of stability, prosperity, and an almost complete absence of major wars. Antoninus himself was a model ruler, modest, just, scrupulous in his affairs, and deeply respectful of the Senate. He never left the borders of Italy, governing the vast empire from his estate at Lorium, setting an example of moderation and frugality. And for the young Marcus Aurelius, he became not just an adoptive father and emperor, but the main teacher of life and statecraft. In his meditation, Marcus describes the image of Antoninus with the deepest gratitude and admiration. He learned from him gentleness, unshakable adherence to considered decisions, a complete lack of vanity, love of labor and perseverance. He observed how Antoninus carefully listened to anyone who offered something useful for the common good, how he knew how to keep friends without being surfeited with them or falling into passionate infatuation, how he was self-sufficient in everything. This was a living embodiment of the Stoic ideal of the sage in power, and Marcus absorbed this example every day for 23 years. Immediately after his adoption, Marcus moved into Hadrian's private chambers, the so-called House of Tiberius on the Palatine. His status had changed. In 139, at the age of 18, he was appointed Caesar, the official heir. He received the right to speak in the Senate, and his name began to be minted on coins. Antoninus methodically and consistently introduced him to the affairs of state. Marcus held the office of consul for the first time in 140, received tribunician power and the supreme proconsular power, sharing with the emperor all the burdens of governance. He studied jurisprudence under the greatest legal scholars of the time, such as Lucius Verus Maecianus, and soon became an authoritative expert on the laws himself, participating in court sessions. However, parallel to his state activities, his philosophical education continued, now reaching its peak. Antoninus, seeing his adopted son's passion for wisdom, surrounded him with the best minds of the time. Among his tutors were the peripatetic Claudius Severus and the Platonist Alexander of Seleucia, but the main place was occupied by two men, the Stoic Quintus Junius Rusticus and the rhetorician Marcus Cornelius Fronto. Junius Rusticus, the grandson of the famous Stoic martyr Aurelius Rusticus, who was executed under Emperor Domitian, became for Marcus the main guide into the world of Stoicism. It was he, as Marcus himself writes, who gave him the Discourses of Epictetus to read, which became a bedside book for the future emperor. Rusticus taught him not to be carried away by rhetorical ostentation, to write simple letters, and most importantly showed him that philosophy is not an abstract theory, but a practical guide to life, the art of correcting and healing one's own character. Completely different was his relationship with Fronto, the most famous advocate and orator of his time. Fronto was the tutor of Marcus and Lucius Verus in Latin rhetoric. The surviving correspondence between him and Marcus is a priceless document that reveals the inner world of the future emperor. Fronto adored his student but was troubled by his excessive passion for philosophy. He tried to convince Marcus that for a future ruler, the art of eloquence, the ability to command words to persuade the Senate and the people, was more important than Stoic paradoxes. He wrote to him, "For if you take away from eloquence the ability to magnify the small, to diminish the great, to present the old in a new way, your philosopher will wander naked and beg for alms." Marcus, while respecting his teacher, politely but firmly defended his choice. His letters are imbued with weariness of empty rhetoric, of the search for rare words, of a bombastic style. He wrote to Fronto of his love for philosophy. "For my part, I would rather renounce life than the pursuit of wisdom." This conflict between rhetoric and philosophy, between external effect and inner truth, was central to his spiritual development. He chose truth. He chose Stoicism not as an intellectual exercise, but as the only possible way to live a worthy life. In 145, an important event took place. Marcus married his cousin, Antoninus' daughter, Faustina the Younger. He was 24, she about 15. Their marriage, which lasted 30 years, was complex and gave rise to many rumors. Ancient historians, especially the authors of the unreliable Historia Augusta, accused Faustina of numerous infidelities, of debauchery, of affairs with gladiators and sailors. However, Marcus himself, in his Meditations, speaks of her with unfailing love and tenderness, thanking the gods for a wife so obedient, so loving, and so simple. He valued her devotion and support. Over the years of their marriage, they had at least 13 children, but most of them died in infancy or youth, which became a series of most severe personal tragedies for Marcus. Only their son Commodus and 4 daughters survived. The years passed. Marcus diligently performed his duties, remaining in the shadow of the pious emperor. He was the ideal heir, loyal, Hard-working, modest, he did not engage in intrigue, did not seek to hasten his accession to power. On the contrary, the thought of supreme power frightened him. He saw it not as a privilege but as a heavy burden, a service that would take from him what was most precious: time for solitude and philosophical reflection. He was learning to govern an empire, but he was learning even more diligently to govern himself. And this long, almost meditative wait of 23 years became the ideal preparation for the horrifying trials that would befall him the very moment he finally accepted the purple toga of an emperor. Rome had never seen anything like it. One emperor dies and one heir is supposed to ascend in his place. It had always been so. But on that cold March day in 161, when the Senate gathered to transfer power to Marcus Aurelius, the unthinkable happened. The heir, standing on the threshold of absolute power, voluntarily renounced its fullness. He demanded that his adoptive brother Lucius Verus stand beside him with equal titles and honors. This was not merely an act of modesty or brotherly love. It was a political precedent that forever changed the nature of imperial power in Rome. Why did a philosopher who despised the vanities of the world share his burden? Was it a manifestation of Stoic humility or a brilliant move by a far-sighted politician who already heard the rumble of an approaching storm and understood that he could not stand against it alone? After the death of Antoninus Pius on March 7th, 161, the Senate unanimously proclaimed Marcus Aurelius as the sole emperor. All the titles of his predecessor, Augustus, Pontifex Maximus, Father of the Fatherland, were offered to him alone. Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, remained in the shadows as he had during Antoninus's lifetime. But Marcus, to the astonishment of the senators, refused to accept power alone. He declared that he would not take office unless Lucius received the exact same powers as he did. This decision was unprecedented. For the first time in the history of the Roman Empire, it had two fully fledged rulers, two Augusti. Marcus, as the elder in age and authority, undoubtedly remained the senior figure. He took the title of Pontifex Maximus, which in Latin means greatest pontiff, which could only be held by one person, but formally their power was equal. Lucius Verus, now about 30 years old, was transformed from a simple heir into a co-ruler. He took the name Lucius Aurelius Verus Augustus, while Marcus was officially styled Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. The motives for this act are still a subject of debate among historians. On the one hand, it was an act of astonishing fidelity to the will of Hadrian, who had originally intended the throne for both. It was a manifestation of the Stoic principle of justice and the sharing of burdens. Marcus may have genuinely not desired the fullness of power and considered it right to share it. On the other hand, it was an extremely shrewd political move. Lucius Verus was popular with the soldiers. He was the complete opposite of the pensive and serious Marcus. He was handsome, charming, a lover of feasts, hunting, and gladiatorial games. By making him co-ruler, Marcus not only neutralized a potential rival who could have become the center of opposition, but also acquired a kind of minister of defense capable of taking command of the troops in the coming wars. Marcus, the philosopher and jurist, preferred to remain in Rome, dealing with civil administration, while the more martial Lucius could go to the front. Perhaps Marcus already foresaw that governing an empire on the brink of a total war on several fronts would be impossible alone. And the storms were not long in coming. The golden age of Antoninus ended literally on the day he died. As if an evil genie had been released from a bottle, misfortunes befell the empire. Shortly after the new emperor's accession, the Tiber overflowed its banks, flooding the lower districts of Rome. The flood destroyed huge stocks of grain in the state warehouses, leading to famine and a sharp rise in food prices. Marcus and Lucius immediately took action, organizing grain shipments from the provinces and personally overseeing its distribution, which prevented riots. But this was only the beginning. Far more serious threats were gathering on the borders. Unrest began in Britain. On the German frontier, the Chatti tribe invaded the provinces of Germania Superior and Raetia. But the most terrible blow came from the east. The Parthian Empire, Rome's long-standing and most powerful rival in the east, decided to take advantage of the change of power in the empire. King Vologases IV, an ambitious and warlike ruler, considered the moment ideal for revenge. In the autumn of 161, Parthian forces invaded Armenia, which was a buffer state between the two empires. They expelled the Roman appointee and placed their own candidate on the throne. Then the Parthians moved into Syria. The Roman legate of Cappadocia, Marcus Sedatius Severianus, an overconfident Gaul who believed the prophecies of the false prophet Alexander of Abonotacus, rushed to meet the enemy with a single legion. At the Battle of Elageia, his army was completely annihilated and Severianus himself committed suicide. The path to the heart of the Roman East was open. Panic seized Syria. The situation was critical. Immediate and decisive intervention was required, and here Marcus's plan with two emperors began to work. It was decided that Lucius Verus would personally go to the east and lead the Roman army. For Marcus, this was an ideal solution. He himself, as the chief strategist and administrator, remained in Rome to govern the state, contain the German threat, and combat the effects of the famine. Lucius, whose reputation required military exploits, got his chance to win fame. In 162, Lucius Verus set out on campaign with great pomp. His journey to the east resembled more a triumphal procession than the urgent dispatch of a commander-in-chief. He stopped in numerous cities, held feasts and hunts, enjoying the luxury of the eastern provinces. Ancient sources portray him as a frivolous playboy who spent his time in amusement in Antioch while his generals waged war. However, modern historians consider this picture exaggerated. Lucius may not have been a brilliant commander, but he was a symbol of imperial authority at the front. He assembled a most powerful army and enlisted the best commanders such as Statius Priscus and, most importantly, Gaius Avidius Cassius. It was these talented military leaders who became the true architects of victory. The war was long and bloody. It lasted 4 years, from 162 to 166. The Romans acted methodically and brutally. First, they drove the Parthians out of Armenia, destroying its capital, Artaxata. Then the war moved to Mesopotamia. In 165, Avidius Cassius stormed and burned to the ground the two largest cities of Parthia, Seleucia on the Tigris and the capital Ctesiphon. It was a crushing blow from which the Parthian Empire never fully recovered. In 166, Vologases IV was forced to sue for peace. Rome annexed northwestern Mesopotamia, restored its control over Armenia, and returned with immense booty. The victory was complete. In October of 166, Marcus and Lucius celebrated a grand triumph in Rome. Both emperors took the title Parthicus Maximus. Marcus's sons, Commodus and Annius Verus, received the titles of Caesar. It seemed the first storm had passed, and the empire, under the wise leadership of two Augusti, had proven its invincible might. But the triumphal chariots entering Rome carried not only glory and trophies. In the baggage trains among the returning legionaries lurked an invisible and merciless enemy that would bring the empire far more death and suffering than all the Parthian arrows. The era of the Great Plague was beginning. Rome was exultant. The streets were strewn with flowers, the air trembled with the ecstatic cheers of the crowd. The two emperors, Marcus and Lucius, rode in gilded chariots towards the capital, leading Parthian captives and displaying the untold treasures of the East. The triumph of 166 was the apex of glory, a symbol of the invincibility of Roman arms. But while the city reveled in victory in its cramped quarters and luxurious villas, an invisible enemy had already begun its silent, deadly harvest. The legionaries returning from the east had brought with them not only victory, but a pestilence that would go down in history as the Antonine plague. This epidemic would become a demographic catastrophe that would sap the empire's strength, devastate its cities and villages, and forever change the face of the Roman world. The greatest triumph had turned into the greatest tragedy. The victory over Parthia was unconditional. Roman eagles once again soared over Mesopotamia. Lucius Verus, having returned to Rome, basked in the rays of glory. Marcus Aurelius, as the supreme ruler, shared all the honors with him. He even betrothed his eldest daughter, the 12-year-old Lucilla, to the 36-year-old Lucius, further strengthening their dynastic alliance. The empire seemed to be at the peak of its power. But it was at this moment of triumph that the first signs of disaster began to appear. Soldiers returning from Mesopotamia began to die from a strange illness. Soon it spread to the civilian population. The epidemic, which had apparently broken out during the siege of Seleucia in 165 now, with the army's return, spread throughout the empire like wildfire. It followed the trade routes, penetrating the most remote corners of the Roman world, from Syria to Gaul and the banks of the Rhine. This was the Antonine plague, so named after Marcus's family name. Modern researchers, based on the descriptions of symptoms left by the famous physician Galen, suggest it was an epidemic of hemorrhagic smallpox, one of the deadliest forms of the disease. Galen, who personally observed the sick in Rome, described fever, diarrhea, inflammation of the throat, and, most characteristically, black or dark red skin rashes that formed scabs after a few days. The mortality rate was horrific. In some regions, it is estimated that up to a third of the population perished. In Rome itself, thousands died daily. Bodies were burned on huge pyres or thrown into mass graves. The consequences of the epidemic were catastrophic and multifaceted. A real demographic collapse occurred. The empire lost, according to various estimates, from 7 to 10 million people. And some sources cite figures as high as 15 or 20% of the total population. Entire villages and cities were depopulated. The army was hit particularly hard. The legions stationed on the borders were decimated, which sharply weakened the state's defensive capabilities. Marcus Aurelius had to resort to extreme measures, recruiting slaves, gladiators, and even barbarians from across the Rhine and Danube into the army, something that was previously unthinkable. An economic crisis began. The sharp decline in population led to a shortage of labor in agriculture and crafts. Fields lay unsown, mines were abandoned, production fell, and trade came to a standstill. State revenues from taxes dropped sharply, while expenditures, especially on the army, only grew. To cover the budget deficit, Marcus Aurelius was forced to resort to debasing the currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius, which in the long run fueled inflation. Society experienced a social and psychological shock. It was gripped by panic and despair. People did not understand the causes of the disease and saw it as the wrath of the gods. Persecutions of Christians began throughout the empire as they were accused of having brought down the gods' anger by their refusal to worship traditional Roman idols. Lynchings and trials became more frequent, the most famous of which was the trial of the martyrs of Lyon in 177. All sorts of superstitions spread. Magicians and charlatans selling amulets and spells flourished. People sought salvation in mystical cults, such as the cult of the Egyptian Isis or the Phrygian Cybele. Marcus Aurelius, as the supreme ruler and high priest, found himself at the center of this storm. His reaction was a model of stoic composure and sense of duty. He did not panic. Instead, he took a series of decisive measures. Firstly, he tried to appease the gods. Grand religious ceremonies were held in Rome, including lectisternia, that is, ritual banquets for the gods whose statues were placed on special couches. Priests of all cults were summoned and numerous sacrifices were made. He tried to restore the so-called Pax Deorum, peace with the gods, which the Romans believed was the guarantor of the state's prosperity. Secondly, he organized a practical fight against the plague's consequences. Laws were issued regulating burials and the sanitary condition of cities. The great physician Galen was summoned to Rome and appointed personal physician to the imperial family. His knowledge was used to combat the epidemic, although ancient medicine was powerless against the virus. Thirdly, and this was the most astonishing step, he tackled the financial crisis. The treasury was empty. To find money for the army's maintenance and state support, Marcus Aurelius held an unprecedented auction in the Forum of Trajan in 169. He put up for sale the personal property of the imperial family, gold and silver tableware, precious cups, the luxurious clothes of his wife Faustina, silks embroidered with gold, and rare works of art that had belonged to Hadrian. The auction lasted for 2 months and brought a huge sum to the treasury, allowing state affairs to continue without introducing new taxes. This act made a huge impression on the Romans. The emperor selling his personal property to save the state became a living symbol of service and self-sacrifice. The plague raged until at least 180, sometimes subsiding, sometimes flaring up with new force. It became the dark backdrop for the rest of Marcus Aurelius's reign. It exhausted the empire, making it vulnerable, and the enemies did not wait long. While Rome was fighting an invisible enemy within on its northern borders, the clouds of a new, even more terrible war were already gathering. The weakened, bled-white empire stood on the threshold of the Marcomannic Wars, the most brutal and prolonged conflict since the Punic Wars. The triumph in the east had turned into a prologue to a struggle for survival in the west. The Danube frontier, known as the Danubian limes, had long been considered relatively quiet. The legions were bored in their camps, the barbarians traded with the Romans or feuded among themselves. But while Rome celebrated its victory over Parthia and suffocated from the plague, entire peoples were set in motion across the vast expanses of Central and Eastern Europe. Like a tectonic shift, the great migration of the Goths from the north pushed Germanic and Sarmatian tribes to the very borders of the empire. They no longer asked for land or alliances. They came for booty and living space, united in powerful confederations and ready for anything. In 166 or 167, this human avalanche broke through the Danube frontier. For Marcus Aurelius, the most terrible war of his life had begun. A war that would last until his death, and would demand from him and the empire the exertion of all their strength. The Marcomannic Wars is the general name for a whole series of conflicts that Rome fought from 166 to 180 against a vast coalition of Germanic and Sarmatian tribi. The core of this coalition were the Marcomanni, who lived in the territory of modern Czechia, and the Quadi, who inhabited the territory of Slovakia. But they were joined by dozens of other peoples: Iazyges, Vandals, Lombards, Buri, Naristi, and many others. The reasons for this explosion were complex. Firstly, it was the pressure from the Goths, migrating from Scandinavia to the Black Sea region. Secondly, overpopulation and a deteriorating climate in Germany itself. Thirdly, the barbarians saw that the Roman Empire was weakened by the plague and the war in the east. They smelled blood. The first invasion occurred in 166 or 167. A 6,000-strong detachment of Lombards and Ubii crossed the Danube in Pannonia, but was repulsed by local forces. However, this was just a reconnaissance in force. Shortly thereafter, the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other tribes demanded permission from Rome to settle on imperial territory. Having been refused, they began a full-scale war. The situation for Rome was desperate. The army was exhausted by the war in the east and decimated by the plague. 2 legions had to be hastily formed from scratch. They were named the 2nd and 3rd Italic legions. The treasury was empty. It was then that Marcus held his famous auction of imperial property. In the autumn of 167, both emperors, Marcus and Lucius, personally went north to Aquileia to lead the defense. The very fact that both Augusti left Rome spoke of the extreme seriousness of the threat. The beginning of the war was catastrophic for the Romans. Barbarian hordes broke through the defenses along the entire Danube. The Marcomanni and Quadi crossed the Alps and invaded northern Italy. It was a shock. For the first time since the Cimbrian War, 250 years earlier, the enemy was on the sacred soil of Italy. The barbarians besieged and destroyed the city of Opitergium, modern Oderzo, and besieged the major center of Aquileia. The praetorian prefect Titus Furius Victorinus tried to stop them, but his army was defeated, and he himself was killed. Panic gripped Rome. The city had not seen an enemy at its gates since the time of Hannibal. Marcus Aurelius ordered the urgent restoration of the city walls, which had not been repaired since the time of the Republic. At this critical moment, Marcus proved himself a cool-headed and decisive commander-in-chief. He organized the defense of Italy, transferred legions from the Rhine frontier and other provinces. He managed to halt the barbarians' advance and push them back from Aquileia. Gradually, at the cost of enormous effort, the Romans began to drive the invaders back across the Alps. But in early 169, as the emperors were returning to Rome from Aquileia, a new misfortune occurred. Lucius Verus, who had never been in robust health and had reportedly suffered greatly from the plague, died suddenly of a stroke. Marcus Aurelius was left alone to face the war and an empire in crisis. He brought his brother's body to Rome, gave him a lavish funeral, and had him deified. Now the full power and all the responsibility for the outcome of the war rested on his shoulders. From this moment on, Marcus Aurelius was almost constantly on the Danube frontier. His main headquarters became the city of Carnuntum in Pannonia, located near modern Vienna. The war turned into a series of grueling, brutal campaigns. It was not a classic war with large battles, but an endless guerrilla struggle in the forests and swamps of Germany, punitive expeditions, sieges of barbarian settlements, and defense of the borders against constant raids. In 170, the empire suffered another terrible defeat. 20,000 Roman soldiers were routed in a battle whose exact location is unknown, and the legate of Pannonia was killed. The Costoboci tribe, living in the Carpathians, broke through all of Moesia and Thrace, reached Greece, and plundered the famous sanctuary at Eleusis. But Marcus did not give up. He methodically rebuilt the army and defenses. He divided the Danubian front into 2 sectors. He himself commanded the troops against the Marcomanni and Quadi, and for the fight against the Sarmatian Iazyges in the east, he appointed the best commanders, such as the future Emperor Pertinax. Step by step, with incredible persistence, the Romans began to turn the tide of the war. It is to this period that 2 famous episodes which Roman propaganda called miracles belong. The first episode is known as the Rain Miracle and occurred around 172. During a campaign deep into Quadi territory, a Roman army was surrounded and suffered from thirst under a scorching sun. When it seemed that death was imminent, a terrible thunderstorm suddenly broke out. A downpour quenched the Roman soldiers' thirst and saved them, while lightning and hail fell upon the barbarians, causing panic among them and allowing the Romans to win a victory. Pagan authors attributed this miracle to the prayers of Marcus Aurelius and the intervention of Jupiter. Christian apologists such as Tertullian claimed that the miracle occurred thanks to the prayers of Christian soldiers from the 12th Thundering Legion. The second episode, the lightning miracle, happened around 173. During a battle with the Iazyges, a huge barbarian siege engine was destroyed by a bolt of lightning. This event was also interpreted as a sign of divine favor for the emperor. Both of these so-called miracles were immediately depicted on coins and on the reliefs of the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, becoming a powerful propaganda tool that raised the morale of the army and the population. By 175, at the cost of incredible losses and efforts, Marcus had managed to win the first phase of the war. He had defeated the Marcomanni and Quadi and was preparing to turn their lands, as well as the lands of the Iazyges, into new Roman provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia. This would have pushed the empire's border far to the north and east, creating a buffer zone and permanently securing Italy. But it was at this decisive moment, when victory was so close, that news came that was a stab in the back. From the east came news of a rebellion. Imagine the scene: a deep night on the banks of a frozen Danube. Outside the thin fabric of the campaign tent, an icy wind howls, and the cries of sentries are heard. Around is the camp of an exhausted, bled-white army, waging an endless, brutal war with barbarians. And inside, by the dim light of an oil lamp, sits a man in a simple soldier's cloak. He is the ruler of the world, Emperor Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. But he is not writing orders or military dispatches. He is writing for himself. Short notes, aphorisms, instructions to himself. He is trying, in the chaos of war, blood and death, to find order, meaning, and peace of mind. It is here, on the edge of civilization, in the very heart of the barbarian world, that one of the greatest philosophical documents in human history is born. A book that posterity will call To Himself, or the Meditations. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is a unique monument. It is not a treatise written for publication. It is not a sermon addressed to disciples. It is a personal diary, an intimate conversation with his own soul, which the emperor kept during the most difficult years of his life, mainly during the Marcomannic Wars. He made the entries themselves in Greek, the language of philosophy, not in Latin, the language of power and law. He titled some sections with notes like, Among the Quadi, On the Granua, or At Carnuntum. These were his daily exercises, a spiritual gymnastics that allowed him to maintain his humanity and sanity in inhuman conditions. To understand the depth of the Meditations, one must constantly remember the context in which they were created. Marcus, a man who valued silence, peace, and contemplation above all else, was forced to spend almost 10 years at the epicenter of violence. Every day he saw death, suffering, and cruelty. He made decisions on which the lives of thousands of people depended. He carried on his shoulders the burden of responsibility for an empire falling apart, and the philosophy of Stoicism became for him not an intellectual hobby, but a lifeline, the only tool for survival. The central idea of the Meditations is the Stoic doctrine of the dichotomy of control. There are things that are in our power and there are things that are not. In our power are our thoughts, judgments, aspirations, our attitude towards what is happening. Outside our power are our body, health, reputation, the actions of other people, natural disasters, war, death. Happiness and peace of mind, called apatheia by the Stoics, according to them, consist in focusing all our efforts on what is in our power and accepting everything else as it should be, as part of the universal order which is governed by a divine reason or logos. Marcus constantly reminds himself of this. Be like the promontory against which the waves continually break, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it. He teaches himself to look at the horrors of war through the eyes of a philosopher. Death, it is a natural process of dissolution into primary elements, a return to nature. Pain, it is just a bodily sensation that should not affect your mind, your ruling part of the soul. Enemies, they act badly only out of ignorance, not understanding what true good and evil are. They should not be hated but pitied and guided onto the right path. The best way to avenge yourself is not to become like the wrongdoer. Another most important theme is the awareness of the transience, the ephemerality of all things. Marcus constantly meditates on the theme of time. He imagines the infinite abyss of the past and future and understands how insignificant the span of human life is. Alexander of Macedon and his mule driver were brought to the same state by death. They were either received up into the same seminal principles of the universe, or were alike dispersed into atoms. Fame, wealth, power, all are smoke, vanity, the clicking of tongues. This thought does not drive him to depression, but, on the contrary, liberates him. If everything is transient, then one should not become attached to things and worry about their loss. The only thing that matters is to live one's short life worthily, in accordance with nature, both one's own, that is, rational, and the universal, that is, with the logos. From this follows the third key idea, the idea of duty. To live in accordance with nature for a human as a social being means to serve the common good. That which is not good for the beehive cannot be good for the bee. Marcus saw his imperial power not as a privilege, but as a service to the human race. He constantly reminds himself that he must get out of bed in the morning, even if he doesn't want to, because he has a job to do. He must be just, merciful, honest, and courageous, not because he will be rewarded in heaven for it. For the Stoics were mostly materialists and did not believe in the immortality of the soul in the Christian sense, but because that is his duty as a man and as an emperor. Live as if you were now on the point of departing from life, and every moment which is granted to you is a pure gain. The Meditations is an astonishing document of the human spirit. It has no coherent system. Thoughts often repeat, jumping from one thing to another. But in this chaotic nature lies its strength and sincerity. We see not the polished facade of a philosopher emperor, but a living man in his struggle with himself. We see his doubts, his weariness, his disgust with courtly flattery and vanity. Say to yourself in the morning, "Today I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial." But he immediately adds that he should not be angry with them because they are his kinsmen, particles of the same universal reason. The book of Marcus Aurelius is the quintessence of his personality. A man who possessed absolute power writes a hymn to moderation and self-restraint. A commander waging a most brutal war preaches forgiveness and love for humanity. A ruler surrounded by luxury reflects on the vanity of all earthly things. The Meditations is not just a philosophical text, it is a practical guide to the survival of the soul in hell. And the fact that it was written on the battlefields makes it one of the most powerful and inspiring testimonies to the strength of the human spirit. The year 175. Victory on the Danube was near. Marcus Aurelius, exhausted by years of war, was preparing to found new provinces and to permanently secure the northern frontier. It seemed the goal of his life was about to be achieved, and at that very moment, like a dagger from around a corner, news came from the east that could destroy everything. Gaius Avidius Cassius, the most celebrated general of the empire, the hero of the Parthian War, the governor of the entire east, had declared himself emperor. The rebellion was raised not by some base-born adventurer, but by a man whom Marcus had trusted as himself. The empire, already torn by war and plague, was on the brink of civil war. For the Stoic on the throne, this was not just a political betrayal. It was a blow to his faith in man and the severest test of his philosophical principles. Gaius Avidius Cassius was a brilliant and charismatic figure. He was born in the Syrian city of Cyrrhus. His father was a famous rhetorician. Cassius had a brilliant military career. He was a true soldier's general, harsh, demanding, who maintained iron discipline in his troops. Legends were told of his severity. He allegedly ordered deserters' hands to be cut off and offending centurions to be crucified. But the soldiers respected and feared him. It was he who was the main architect of the victory in the Parthian War. It was his legions that took Ctesiphon. After the war, Marcus Aurelius appointed him governor of Syria and then gave him extraordinary powers over all the eastern provinces from Egypt to Cappadocia. In effect, Cassius was the viceroy of the East. What drove him to rebellion? The reasons were multifaceted. Firstly, his own ambitions. He considered himself more worthy of the throne than the philosophizing old man Marcus. He positioned himself as a supporter of a firm hand, arguing that the empire needed discipline, not philosophical discussions. Secondly, he was supported by the local Eastern aristocracy who were dissatisfied that all attention and resources were going to the Danubian War. But the trigger was a false rumor. In early 175, a rumor spread through the eastern provinces that Marcus Aurelius, whose health was indeed undermined by years of campaigns, had died on the Danube. Without waiting for confirmation, Avidius Cassius immediately proclaimed himself emperor. He was supported by the legions stationed in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Egypt was a key region, the breadbasket of Rome, and its loss could cause famine in the capital and paralyze the empire. Some ancient sources, particularly Dio Cassius and the Historia Augusta, add a piquant detail to this story, that Empress Faustina herself incited Cassius's rebellion. According to their version, she, concerned about her husband's poor health and fearing for the future of her young son Commodus in the event of Marcus's death, secretly corresponded with Cassius and promised him her hand and the throne if the emperor died. This version is most likely malicious gossip, aimed at blackening Faustina's memory. Marcus himself never showed a shadow of a doubt in his wife's loyalty and insisted on her deification after her death. When news of the rebellion reached Marcus's camp on the Danube, it was a shock to everyone. But the emperor's reaction amazed even his closest circle. He did not fall into rage or despair. He gathered the soldiers and delivered a speech which Dio Cassius records in his Roman history. In this speech, there is no hatred for the traitor. On the contrary, Marcus expresses regret that he may have to enter a civil war. He says that his only desire is to forgive Cassius if he repents, and to show the world an example of how such a conflict can be resolved without bloodshed. "The only thing I fear, soldiers," he said, "is that he will either kill himself, ashamed to appear before me, or that someone else will kill him. Then I will be deprived of the great reward of victory, namely to forgive a man who has wronged me." This was the speech of a true Stoic. But behind the philosophical calm was sober calculation. Marcus understood that a civil war would be a death sentence for the empire. It would open the Danubian frontier to the barbarians and destroy everything that had been achieved at such a terrible price. Therefore, he acted quickly and decisively. He concluded a hasty but favorable peace with the Iazyges, abandoning his plans for new provinces, and immediately moved his battle-hardened Danubian army to the east. Fortunately for Marcus, the rebellion was short-lived. As soon as it became known in the east that the emperor was alive and marching with an army, Cassius's support began to melt away. The governor of Cappadocia, Marcus Verus, who had remained loyal to Marcus, began to act against the rebels. The Senate in Rome immediately declared Cassius an enemy of the state. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. 3 months and 6 days after the start of the rebellion, Avidius Cassius was killed by his own soldiers, by a centurion named Antoninus. His head was brought to Marcus Aurelius. The emperor, as sources say, refused to look at his enemy's head and ordered it to be buried with honor. He kept his word. None of Cassius's supporters, with rare exceptions, were executed. Their property was not confiscated. He even forbade the Senate from conducting too harsh an investigation. He spared Cassius's children and provided them with a decent life. This act of clemency was unprecedented in Roman history, where rebellions always ended in bloody proscriptions. Despite the quick suppression of the rebellion, Marcus decided to personally go to the east to restore order and loyalty in the provinces. His wife Faustina and son Commodus went with him. This journey became another severe trial for him. On the way, in the small village of Halala in Cappadocia, his beloved wife Faustina, who had accompanied him in all his campaigns and had received from the soldiers the honorary title of Mater Castrorum, which translates as Mother of the Camps, died suddenly. The cause of her death is unknown. Perhaps it was an illness, perhaps an accident. For Marcus, this was a most severe personal loss. He founded a city on the site of her death, Faustinopolis, and obtained her deification from the Senate. He continued his journey. He visited Syria, where he showed mercy to the inhabitants of Antioch who had supported the rebellion. Then he went to Egypt. On the way, he stopped in Athens, the center of Greek philosophy, where he was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries and established 4 chairs of philosophy for all the main schools: Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, and Epicurean, appointing professors with state salaries. This was a gesture of deep respect for the wisdom that was his guiding star. In the autumn of 176, after an absence of almost 8 years, Marcus Aurelius returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph, this time over the Germans and Sarmatians. Beside him in the chariot rode his 15-year-old son Commodus, whom he had made his co-ruler, giving him the title of Augustus. The civil war had been averted, the East was pacified. It seemed that the exhausted emperor could finally rest, but it was only a short respite. The barbarians on the Danube, taking advantage of his absence, had again broken the peace. The final act of the tragedy was yet to come. Rome greeted its emperor with a triumph. After 8 years of war and turmoil, Marcus Aurelius had returned to the capital a victor. It seemed that the worst storms had passed, but on the aging philosopher's face already lay the shadow of sunset. His health was broken, his soul wounded by losses. And before him stood the last and perhaps most agonizing question of his life, the question of a successor. The system of adoptive emperors, which had given Rome a century of prosperity, was about to fail. Beside him stood his own son, Commodus, and the choice that Marcus would make would become his most controversial and tragic mistake. Was it blind paternal love, or a desperate attempt to prevent a new civil war? This choice would determine the fate of the empire for decades to come and would become a dark epilogue to the life of the philosopher on the throne. Returning to Rome in 176, Marcus Aurelius spent a little over a year in the capital. It was a time of relative peace and attempts to restore normal life in a tormented empire. He engaged in legislation, administered justice, and arranged generous cash distributions to the population, trying to alleviate the consequences of the crisis. He also published his accounts of the Marcomannic Wars, which, unfortunately, have not survived. The central event of this period was the elevation of his only surviving son, Lucius Aurelius Commodus. Marcus, unlike his predecessors, had a direct heir by blood, and he did everything to ensure a smooth and undisputed transfer of power. As early as 175, during Cassius's rebellion, he had summoned the 14-year-old Commodus to the front and invested him with the so-called toga virilis, the toga of an adult male. In 176, Commodus shared the triumph with his father, and in 177, Marcus took the decisive step. He granted his 16-year-old son the title of Augustus, making him a full co-ruler. This decision still provokes fierce debate among historians. Why did Marcus Aurelius, the quintessence of wisdom and insight, a product of the system of the best, choose as his successor a youth whose character already raised serious concerns. Commodus was the complete opposite of his father. He showed no interest in either philosophy or state affairs. His passions were horses, gladiatorial games, and coarse pleasures. He was physically strong, handsome, but at the same time vain, capricious, and cruel. Why did Marcus do this? He was probably driven by several motives. Firstly, the dynastic principle. The idea of hereditary monarchy was already deeply rooted in the Roman consciousness. Refusing to pass power to his own son could have been seen as a public humiliation for him and could have provoked instability. Secondly, the bitter experience of Avidius Cassius's rebellion. Marcus had seen how easily a power struggle could erupt at the slightest uncertainty. By appointing Commodus as co-ruler, he was clearly and unambiguously indicating to all potential usurpers that the question of succession was settled. This was an attempt to prevent a new civil war after his death, which he foresaw. Thirdly, paternal love and hope. Perhaps Marcus believed to the last that he could raise his son, that the burden of responsibility would change him. He surrounded Commodus with the best advisors and tried to instill in him a sense of duty. In his meditations, he thanks the gods that his son did not turn out feeble-minded or deprimé. Perhaps he simply turned a blind eye to the worst traits of his character, hoping for the best. In any case, the choice was made. But peaceful life in Rome did not last long. In 178, the barbarians on the Danube, violating the treaties concluded before the campaign to the east, once again invaded the empire's territory. The Marcomannian Quadi reared their heads again. The old and sick emperor had to go to war again. On August 3, 178, Marcus Aurelius and his 17-year-old co-ruler Commodus left Rome and headed for the Danube frontier. It was his last war. The Second Marcomannic War was no less brutal than the first. Marcus again set up his headquarters at Carnuntum, and then perhaps at Vindobona, the site of modern Vienna. He acted decisively and successfully. The greatest Roman commander of the time, Tarquinius Paternus, defeated a huge barbarian army. The Romans again crossed the Danube and conducted military operations in enemy territory. The plans for creating the provinces of Marcomannia and Sarmatia were revived. Victory was near, but the emperor's strength was failing. Years of wars, constant strain, personal tragedies, and perhaps the very plague that had devastated his empire had undermined his health. In early 180, he fell seriously ill. Realizing he was dying, he summoned Commodus to his side and, in the presence of his closest friends and advisors, addressed him with a final speech. He implored his son to see the war through to a victorious conclusion, not to yield to the temptations of luxury and power, and to listen to wise counselors. On March 17, 180, at the age of 58, Marcus Aurelius passed away. The exact place of his death is unknown, either Vindobona or Sirmium in Pannonia. The cause of death was most likely the same Antonine plague, although some later sources suggested poisoning arranged by Commodus, but this is not confirmed. His last words, addressed to a servant who asked for the password for the day, were, "Go to the rising sun, for I am already setting." The emperor's body was transported to Rome. The Senate and the people sincerely mourned him. He was immediately deified, and his ashes were interred in the mausoleum of Hadrian. Statues were erected in his honor throughout the empire, and many ordinary people kept his image in their homes like icons. But with his death, an entire era came to an end. Commodus, barely waiting for his father's death, immediately called off the war. He made a peace with the barbarians that many considered shameful, abandoned all his father's conquests, and hurried back to Rome, to pleasures and amusements. The era of the 5 good emperors was over. The Golden Age gave way to an age of iron and rust, as the historian Cassius had predicted. The philosopher on the throne was gone, leaving behind an empire on the brink of chaos, and a son who would become one of the most insane and cruel tyrants in the history of Rome. The death of Marcus Aurelius was not just the end of one reign. It became a symbolic threshold, a watershed between two eras. With him, the era of the Pax Romana in its classical sense, an era of stability, legality, and relatively enlightened rule passed into history. A long and painful process of decline began, which historians would call the crisis of the 3rd century. The testament of the philosopher on the throne was almost immediately forgotten by his own son, and then by a succession of barracks emperors who would tear the empire apart in their struggle for power. The legacy of Marcus Aurelius proved to be deeply paradoxical. On the one hand, as an emperor, he left his successor a state exhausted by almost 20 years of war and an unprecedented epidemic. Its financial system was undermined, its army weakened, and its demographic losses were irreparable. His most controversial decision, the transfer of power to Commodus, turned out to be a disaster. From this point of view, his reign can be seen as the beginning of the end of the Golden Age. Historians like Edward Gibbon saw him as a noble but tragic ruler whose efforts only postponed the inevitable collapse. But there is another side to his legacy, far more enduring and significant. It is the legacy not of an emperor, but of a philosopher, his meditations. That secret diary written for himself in a campaign tent has outlived both his empire and all subsequent eras. This small book has become one of the eternal bestsellers of world literature, a source of comfort and wisdom for countless generations of people. From Frederick the Great to Bill Clinton, from soldiers in the trenches of the First World War to modern entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. People of the most diverse faiths and professions have found in the words of the Roman emperor answers to eternal questions. What is the secret of this enduring popularity? Marcus Aurelius does not offer easy solutions or metaphysical revelations. His philosophy is extremely practical. He teaches courage in the face of adversity, self-control in a world of chaos, and service to the common good in a selfish world. He shows by his own example that human dignity lies not in external achievements, but in inner integrity, in the ability to maintain clarity of mind and kindness of heart in the most unbearable circumstances. Historical assessments of his personality vary. For some, he is the ideal philosopher on the throne. Plato's dream become reality. For others, a tired and somewhat rigid dogmatist whose adherence to Stoicism prevented him from seeing reality, especially when it came to his own family. Still others point to the cruelty of his wars and the persecutions of Christians that occurred during his reign as proof that even the wisest ruler cannot escape the blood and violence inherent in power. But perhaps the true greatness of Marcus Aurelius lies precisely in this tragic rift between the ideal and reality. He was not a god descended to earth. He was a man who fought a battle every day. A battle against barbarians on the frontier, against plague in the cities, against traitors at court. But his most important battle took place in the depths of his own soul. It was a battle to preserve reason, mercy, and a sense of duty in a world that seemed to have gone mad. He did not win this battle definitively. He could not save the empire from decline, and he could not raise a worthy son. But the very fact of this struggle, recorded on the pages of his diary, became his main victory and his immortal legacy. The story of Marcus Aurelius is not a story of success in the usual sense. It is the eternal drama of a man who took upon his shoulders the entire weight of the world and carried it to the end, finding support only in the strength of his own spirit. And in this, his echo continues to resonate through the corridors of eternity, reminding us that even in the deepest darkness one can and must seek the light within oneself.